is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The 28th World Economic Forum on Africa was held in Cape Town at the beginning of September. The forum brought together world leaders in various fields to discuss solutions to some of Africa's biggest challenges in economic and social development. Well, one such challenge is climate change and Africa's vulnerability to it. So what measures should African leaders and policymakers around the world take to prepare for the increasing severity of weather-related disasters across Africa? I'm Beatrice Marshall from the World Economic Forum in Cape Town, South Africa. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, Africa is one of the places that is most vulnerable to climate change in the world. This vulnerability is further exacerbated by numerous factors, including poverty, poor governance, and a high dependence on natural resources. Before we hear from our panel of experts, let's take a look at some of the biggest climatic disasters that have taken place recently on the continent.
Cyclone Idai made landfall in Mozambique in March 2019 before cutting a deadly path across the southeast African region. The cyclone reached peak wind speeds of around 200 kilometers per hour and wreaked catastrophic damage in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. Idai is the deadliest cyclone ever to be recorded in the southwest Indian Ocean and caused the deaths of over 600 people and an estimated $2 billion in damage. The impoverished nation of Mozambique suffered another deadly Category 4 cyclone just 6 weeks later. In late April, Cyclone Kenneth made landfall with wind speeds of over 200 kilometers per hour. Flooding, high winds, and disease resulted in over 50 deaths both on the African mainland and in the Union of Comoros. Africa has also suffered from severe drought in the East African region over the past few years. In 2011 and 2012, the worst drought in 60 years occurred, and millions of people were affected in Somalia, Djibouti, Ethiopia, and Kenya. In a region heavily reliant on agriculture, failed rains in 2 consecutive seasons caused a humanitarian disaster. A severe food crisis displaced millions and caused tens of thousands of deaths. The region continues to be affected by poor rainfall and drought. Wildfires have also caused massive destruction and death across Africa. NASA has estimated that Africa is home to at least 70% of wildfires across the world daily, with many of those occurring in Angola and Congo. In South Africa's Western Cape province, an estimated 44 people died due to wildfires between October 2018 and April 2019. Climate change across Africa has also caused several mudslides in the last few years. In Uganda, 40 people were killed in October 2018, while Sierra Leone lost over 1,000 people to mudslides in August 2017.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I now welcome my distinguished panel, His Excellency Danny Fore, the President of the Seychelles, Director Andisa Mlisa. She is the Managing Director at Observation South African National Space Agency, SASA, in South Africa. Dr. Helmut Fluher, he is the Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Weather Tech in Switzerland, and we are very interested to hear about your rainmaking initiative. And Bert Strebel, the Managing Director and Head of the Middle East and Africa Swiss Re in Switzerland. We'll be talking about insurance with you. President Fore, I'm going to start off with you and jump right into it because climate change does present quite unique challenges for the small island developing states. And if the world fails to halt global warming, they may disappear altogether. So what is the one step that your government is taking that has had the greatest impact in combating climatic risk, reducing vulnerability, and building resilience?
I think the number one thing that we have done as Seychelles and also as a member of the community is to say that it is our human right to survive. So it is a question of our own survival as members of of one humanity. So climate change is the #1 threat to humanity. So we take it very seriously. So as a small island country with other small island nations within the African continent, we have been able to mobilize the continent, and I'm happy to say today that within the African continent, we have one common position in terms of climate change. Of course, Africa as one continent is also vulnerable. Not only vulnerable, but we have the least in terms of capacity to adapt. So as a country, we have put in place mechanism. In Seychelles, we have the right mitigation strategies in terms of how do we create the necessary resilience against this #1 threat to humanity.
So when you talk about Africa has a common climate change policy, though, do you think Africa's concerns are receiving enough international attention?
So basically, as a continent, we continue to advocate, but it all depends on other nations around the world. And in December, we will be going to the COP25 as one united Africa to continue to press for the necessary financing in terms of mitigation and adaptation.
So, and this one, let's look at a real life example here and look at the situation of Mozambique and Cyclone Idai and kind of that caused massive devastation there. In terms of early preparedness, early warning systems, did we see that coming?
Unfortunately not. And this is one of the things that makes climate change so devastating for countries like continents like Africa, where we've got the least vulnerable people. And our technologies are meant to enable this. From a national space agency perspective, data is the order of the day. We're talking about democratizing data, building platforms and systems that will enable our government to build early warning systems is one of the critical issues. So one of the major things that we're needing to be looking at is that science and data is an enabler into this environment. So how do we build early warning systems that are informed by data, reliable data, timely data, accurate data? Digital Earth Africa is one of the key flagship programs that we have now in the continent to say to our governments, here is a platform where satellite data, over 50 years of monitoring, we've managed to put it in a platform where it's easily accessible, where it's easily processed, and where products are easily accessible to anyone and any man on the street. It's a game changer if you're thinking about it. Now, for Cyclone Idai, if we actually had a platform like that before, what we get to call a disaster, because the geohazards are going to happen, the rainfalls are going to come. This we cannot change. It's going to happen, but it's how it impacts us as people that it matters the most. And for that, we need to make sure that we've got strong enough early warning systems, but we need to make sure that data plays a good part in preparing our early warning systems.
So, Dr. Flora, your company invented, a technology, a system that creates rain and rainfall. And I do want to draw on your example from Jordan, where that technology boosted an increase of about 27% of rainfall over 5,000 kilometers. This can be an answer to Africa's persistent drought situations. Can that be replicated on the continent?
Yeah, of course, and we are already talking to different governments. We started out in 2003 with research work. The Swiss government supported us, and we made tests in Arab countries. We worked in Australia. We worked for governments only. The technology is very environmentally friendly by ETH and Max Planck and others researched, and it's an ionization process, and we cracked the code what happens the hour before a rainfall started. It was known that electricity and other have an impact, and Jordan was now a long test. It was 3 years and a long contract, and the impact is 27% more rain in the 30-year average, and because the surrounding areas are, thanks to climate change, 8% less, so it's 35%. Agricultural growth, 30%. What I've seen here the last months traveling up and down the continent, I must say we have to act with the speed of the problem, not with the speed of some bureaucratic institutions. and then we can have a solution.
But for Africa, though, one of some of the big issues would be cost of the technology and transfer of that technology. What would be some of the challenges for a continent such as Africa that is now facing persistent drought in implementing a technology such as yours?
We are since 15 years without competition. It's very, very complex. Yeah, so we are a service, and the costs are 1 cubic meter of rain is 1 cent. 1 cube, and then it vapors 80–90%, and then it stays, and the cubic meter usable water is 10 cents. When you do pumping and piping, then it's around 40–50 cents. When you do desalination, it's $1 to $3. So we are by far most inexpensive. The volume is very big. The influence to the GDP in Jordan is so big that they can pay us easily out of the additional tax income. So the important, and thank you for the question, yeah, is who is bridging the initial financing. And we talked to some countries, I want to not mention the names, yeah, but big countries in Africa, and it's only the question how to bridge. And now in Switzerland and London, there are groups forming who will do this as an impact investment. When we sign a contract, we are there in the country in 2 months later, and we can operate when the humidity is there the day afterwards. So it's not a question of timing, and it's not, and here was the meeting about infrastructures, yeah? Think about desalination. No country in Africa can afford really big desalination, yeah? But most of the people live near the coast, and we can pull in the humidity from the coast 100 kilometers to 150 kilometers, depends if there are hills or not there. And then it rains. We recreate and revitalize the structure which was there before climate change.
All right, so we come to the question of financing, because Dr. Flores mentioned that whole question of financing, and I do want to come back to Cyclone Idai and Cyclone Kenneth, because your research from your reinsurance company shows that over 2017 and 2018, the industry paid about $219 billion in claims from weather-related events. But for Cyclone Idai, your company, though, reported that the overall economic loss for Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe was in the order of $2 billion, of which only 7% will be covered by the insurance, leaving a gap of about 93%. That is a huge gap.
Indeed, it is. And we're talking very big numbers, and alluding to what Helmut said, climate change challenge is not something in the future. It's something which is here and now, and it's massive. And if you look at it in relative terms, we're always talking about tropical cyclone in the United States or flooding in Europe, but Idai in Mozambique basically represents 15% of GDP of the country. It's going to throw back the country in its development several years. And so, yes, obviously these events are devastating. And it's true that in Africa, the insured part of these losses is significantly lower than globally. Globally it's low. It's only about 1/3 of values are on average insured, but in Africa it's below 10%. For me as a member of the industry, it's frustrating. I look at a 2 billion economic loss, then I see there's less than a 200 million insured loss. I look at our own loss, and I say, I'd be happy to pay more. It's really an insignificant economic loss for Swiss Re. And the reason is because the penetration of insurance is so low. So we have a massive task ahead of us as a system with all our partners, with stakeholders, with government, with regulators, with NGOs, with the insurance associations, with technology firm. All together, we need to increase penetration of insurance as a solution to provide people relief after such an event. Immediate relief, they need the money right after the event. So yes.
So in terms of increasing that low penetration, and you're talking about the insured part of Africa being below 10%, help us to understand what countries like Mozambique, though, can do to bridge that gap and meet your requirements.
Yeah. So it's think one very important element is we all come together. So as I said before, government, regulator, insurance companies, but then we need technology firms, we need ecosystems, platforms, because historic insurance products are probably too complex and not affordable for people with low income. So we need to design very simple products, very efficient distribution, and there's very, very simple claims payment. So for example, if you have a small amount and have a loss adjuster going out there making the adjustment, maybe an alternative is to think in terms of parametric solutions, so that you make a payout immediately if a certain weather condition is given. So if you have a hurricane above a certain strength, that triggers the payout, and a few days later, the money is there. So I think there is solutions. There's a lot of good examples from different countries in the world, in China, in Latam, in Kenya. We did some really cool stuff with farmers, but so much more to do. And I think it's a real big task we have as a system all together.
So this is a collective responsibility for all stakeholders, President Faure, because businesses and African governments and the citizens as well all have a role to play in building resilience and combating the effects of climate change. So if you can just tell us how governments and business leaders can work together to identify these climatic risks so as to invest in building resilience.
At the end of the day, I think governments are there to serve the nation, serve citizens. And it is about the type of design that we need to put in place. Certainly, I would say 10 years or 20 years ago, the whole structure of government was not designed to deal with the problem of climate change. We take the example of Mozambique. Mozambique has gone through 20 years of civil war. And at the end of civil war, they put in place a political system to build a nation. No attention was given on the type of roads to be resilient enough to stand up with a cycle. The type of houses were never built for that. So basically, it has eroded more than 20 years of efforts in Mozambique. So it's really now, from the point of view of policymakers, is rethinking how do we redesign, what type of houses do we need to prepare, the type of roads that we need to have in place, the type of infrastructure. And all this comes with a cost. And I think this is where the international community needs to come into place. I don't think it's a question that we are there, we have the capacity and capability to solve these problems on our own. And it is a collective responsibility of the international financial organizations to come into place. And here I want to challenge the existing financial architecture in the world today. Because we do not take the issue, the subject matter of climate change as a factor when we go about in giving support to other countries. And I think this is what is needed today. So I think we call for a new global order in the fight against global warming and climate change, so that we put systems in place to better serve the citizens and serve humanity.
Let's talk about those systems that need to be put in place, and this, what is needed though from both the public and the private sector in terms of planning, in terms of preparing and responding to natural disasters, because government, it seems, is doing its part.
I think there's a starting point where we need to build some form of trust in our collaborations amongst the different sectors, whether it's within the scientific community and the private sector and the governments. In most cases, we do have solutions that can actually support government coming from the scientific and the private sector communities. However, the prioritization of the funding by our governments is something that government needs to look at in order to make sure that the solutions that have been put in place or have been developed are actually operationalized and actually mainstreamed within government decision. When we ask for finance for whether it's satellite-built programs or in this particular case, just platforms to enable the data that we already have, these decades of information, when you put this in front of government, government responds with, how am I supposed to put money on a technology to do that when I need to build houses, when I need to give people food, when I need to create employment? This is a question. But actually the question is also the other way around. What is your choice if you do not invest in this? How are you going to know that the houses you're wanting to build, you're not building in a floodplain? And you build those houses and tomorrow Cyclone Idaho comes and all of those houses are gone. Because from a scientific entities as well is we do not operationalize. We look at private sector to take what we've put in place and they operationalize. But we look at our governments to fund these operational platforms.
In terms of trying to bring that together, let me bring you back to the insurance and how African countries are covered by that. How are insurers though helping Africa in this regard?
We try to help in the three dimensions, as I mentioned before. One is really prevention, and we have already spoken quite about it. Building codes, for example, or where are you allowed to build, in which areas, in very exposed areas, or not, all these things, education, and so on. Then how to manage an actual disaster. We have a team, public sector solutions team, with a lot of expertise in this area as well, supporting governments. And then obviously, again, the relief part. Capital and capacity in Africa is not a limitation. No. I mentioned before our exposure, despite the fact that we are a market leader in Mozambique, is very limited. We could write so much more. So from this perspective, supply is not the issue, but supply and demand do not meet, because actually what we offer is maybe not what the consumers need or can afford. So we need to, the supply and the demand curve, we need to make them match at one point of time. Affordability, I think, yes, what we offer now is for most people not affordable. We can influence affordability, obviously one is by increase of income of the consumers, but by making products more efficient, by more efficient distribution, but as well by subsidies from governments, at least as a kickstart in the beginning, as well, donations in the beginning. The tools are there. We need to, I think all together we need to do a better job of making it work and helping to make here the world less vulnerable, more resilient to these events.
I think we need to catch up, Marshall.
Yeah.
I think we need to catch up. You know, science is there for us. Government, we need to understand. Policymakers, we need to understand the science. The technology is there. How do you make available this technology to other countries? How international partners come into play? Yeah. You know, we are running out of time.
So we're going to wind up in a minute. I'm told I have 5 minutes left, and I want to get a commitment from all of you on the floor. I know, Melissa, you have something to say here, but let me start with you, President Faure. Your takeaways from this situation and your personal commitment at the World Economic Forum for Africa. So over the next 3 years, though, what would be the one solution you will implement or you think should be implemented to deal with the effects of climate change in your country or in Africa? Very briefly, we have a very short time.
I think as a state and as a leader, as a president of the country, we have taken a series of decisions. We need to implement decisions. We cannot have summit after summit. I think we need to implement the decisions. And we can only implement the decisions that we have taken whereby partners that have pledged to put the money, they also do their bit. So it's a partnership as Melissa said, there has to be trust. It takes two to tango. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Flora.
That's a clear call to action. If we don't act now, yeah, we are losers. And we lose more, not only for our next generation, it's already us. Yeah? We are not so old that we will not see it. Yeah? And I hope that we can roll out. Yeah? Financing is ready. The people are ready. We are happy to help. Yeah? But there has to be a PPP, yeah? Private partnership. Yeah? And and when the session is finished, we can talk.
And this one.
From the Earth observations community, our pledge is very clear. We have a data platform that goes back 50 years of satellite imagery covering the whole of the continent, Digital Earth Africa. And the invitation is tap into this platform and actually see what you can see of your country. The questions around security, whether climate change to be a security issue, all you need to do is to view the change of water issues and transboundary issues. Here's a platform where if you're sitting in Zimbabwe, you can see what your fellow countrymen or neighbors are doing with the same water source that you're dependent on because you're downstream up north. The issue and the impact in Mozambique from Idao was not about the amount of rainfall that fell within Mozambique. It's the amount of water that came from the neighboring countries. We need to actually start looking at this issue as going across boundaries. It's not about what each country is doing, is about what do you understand about what's happening even in your neighboring countries to enable you to put proper response mechanism in your own country. We cannot say data is an issue anymore. We're no longer there. We cannot say the processing platforms because it's big data is an issue anymore. We're making the commitment. Thank you to the Australian government and the Helmsley Foundation for actually allowing us, for Africa to be the first continent to build a data cube that's continent-wide. All we can now need to do is to show, can it actually help our governments and us as society to make better decisions?
Right, Beth.
So I guess from Swiss Re, you get more than a commitment. This is actually the purpose. This is the reason why we exist as Swiss Re, to make the world more resilient and to help narrowing that protection gap. And it's actually one of the main reasons why when I was looking for a new job end of last year, I decided to move with my family 11,000 kilometers further south to Cape Town to work with my teams and together make a contribution to the continent, dedicate my energy, my life, my passion to, although it's going to be a small one, but to make an impact and make sure that we have next IDAI in Mozambique in a few years, the relevance of our system, the tragedy is gonna be minor than it is now.
Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our session, Combating Africa's Climate Challenges. Thank you very much for your interest and your patience. And may I thank my distinguished panelists, His Excellency Danny Fore, President of the Seychelles, Director Andisa Lisa, Dr. Helmut Fura, and Bert Estrebel. Thank you very much for your contribution. This is now a wrap. Good evening.
And that's all we have time for this week on Talk Africa, but a big thank you to all my guests. Remember, we'd love to hear your feedback through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. To keep the conversation going and tune in again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, at the World Economic Forum in Cape Town, it's goodbye.